Have you ever written a Python program where a variable worked perfectly in one place but suddenly stopped working somewhere else? Or maybe Python gave you an error saying something like name error, name X is not defined, even though you know you defined that variable earlier. If that has ever happened to you, the issue is probably variable scope. In this video, you're going to learn what scope means in Python, the difference between local variables and global variables, why scope exists in programming, the common mistakes beginners make, and how to use the global keyword correctly. By the end of this video, you'll clearly understand how Python decides where variables exist and where they don't. Let's get started. First, let's define scope. Scope simply means where a variable is accessible in your program. In other words, scope determines which parts of your code can see or use a variable. Think of scope like rooms in a house. Imagine you leave your phone in the kitchen. You can use the phone inside the kitchen, but if you go to the bedroom, you no longer have access to it unless you bring it with you. Variables behave the same way. Some variables exist only inside certain parts of the program, while others exist everywhere. In Python, the two main scopes beginners need to understand are global scope and local scope. Let's start with global variables. A global variable is a variable that is defined outside of any function. Because it is outside of functions, it can usually be accessed anywhere in the program. Here's an example. We have a variable x which equals 10, a function named print number which prints out x, and then after the function definition we call the function. When we run this program, Python prints 10. Why? Because the variable x is defined outside the function, so the function is able to access it. That means x is a global variable. Global variables are visible to functions, other code, and most places in the program. But there is an important rule you need to understand. Functions can read global variables by default, but they cannot modify them directly unless we explicitly tell Python to allow it. We'll talk about that later. First, let's look at local variables. A local variable is a variable that is created inside a function. It only exists within that function. Once the function finishes running, that variable disappears. Here's an example. We have a function named myFunction. Inside it, we make a variable x and make it equal 5. Then we print x. After the function definition, we then call the function. When we run this code, the output is 5. But what happens if we try to access x outside the function? If we change the code to the same function but take the print statement out of it, then call the function and then print x after and run it, Python gives us an error. Name error, name x is not defined. Why? Because x only exists inside the function. It is a local variable. Once the function finishes running, Python deletes it from memory. So outside the function, x does not exist. This is one of the most common beginner mistakes. People assume that variables created inside functions will exist will exist everywhere in the program, but they don't. They only exist within their scope. So why does scope exist? You might be wondering, why does Python work this way? Why not just make every variable global? The reason is organization and safety. Imagine you are working on a program with hundreds of functions. If every variable were global, then one function might accidentally change a variable used by another function, and bugs would become extremely difficult to track down. Scope prevents this. It isolates variables so that functions don't accidentally interfere with each other. Think of functions like independent machines. Each machine has its own set of variables that it uses internally. This keeps programs predictable and easier to debug. Now let's talk about something that confuses a lot of beginners. Functions can read global variables, but they cannot change them unless we use the global keyword. Here is an example. We declared a variable x equal to 10, then we define a function named change number. Inside the function, we try to set x equal to 5. Then after the function definition, we call the function, and after that we print x. What do you think the output will be? Some people expect it to print 5. But the output is actually 10. Why? Because the variable inside the function is local. Python treats it as a completely different variable from the global one. So the function creates a new local variable called x, but it does not change the global variable. If you actually want to modify a global variable inside a function, you must use the global keyword. Here's how it works. Let's say we have this code. X equals 10. Define a function called change number. Inside it put global x and x equals 5. After the function definition, call the function, then print x. Now the output is 5. Why did this change? Because the line global x tells Python, when I say x inside this function, I mean the global variable. So now the function modifies the global variable instead of creating a local one. Let's talk about a common beginner mistake. One very common error beginners encounter looks like this. In this code, we make a variable x and make it equal 10. Then we define a function called add1. Inside the function, we make a variable called x and give it the value x equals x plus 1. Then we print x. Then after the function definition, we call the function. When you run this code, Python throws an error like unbound local error. This happens because Python thinks x is a local variable since you're trying to assign it, but at the same time, you are trying to use its value before defining it locally. To fix this, you must declare it as global, like in the code I'm about to show you now. Now it works correctly. Here is an important best practice. Avoid globals when possible. Even though global variables are useful sometimes, most professional programmers avoid using them when possible. Why? Because global variables make programs harder to maintain. Instead, a better approach is to pass values into functions and return values back out. For example, in this code, look at how we pass the value num into the function named add1, and then we return num plus 1. This approach is cleaner, safer, easier to debug, and more reusable. That's why professional code bases try to minimize global variables. Let's quickly review what we learned. Scope determines where variables are accessible. There are two main types beginners should understand: global variables, which are defined outside functions and accessible throughout the program, and local variables, which are defined inside functions and only exist within that function. Functions can read global variables, but they cannot modify them unless you use the global keyword. And finally, although global variables exist, the best practice is to avoid relying on them too much. Understanding scope is extremely important in Python. Almost every real program uses functions, and functions depend on scope rules to work correctly. If you master this concept now, your programs will be cleaner, easier to debug, and much more professional. Alright guys, thanks for watching. Remember to like the video, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any future uploads.